It was a still morning in Chipping-Dean, the sort of morning that wrapped itself in a hush of respectability and restraint. The villagers, clad in subdued coats and with handkerchiefs neatly folded in gloved hands, had gathered at the modest parish church to bid farewell to Mr. Leonard Brabazon, a gentleman of quiet means and unimpeachable reputation. His passing, though not entirely unexpected, had sent a mild ripple through the village lanes, not because it was tragic, but because it marked the end of a chapter so comfortably familiar. Miss Marple had taken her seat, as she often did in such matters, in the last pew, not out of modesty, but from a long-practiced understanding that one often heard and saw more from the rear. She had not known Mr. Brabazon intimately, though their paths had crossed during garden fêtes and charity teas. Still, her instincts told her that her life, so outwardly uneventful, might conceal a curious tangle of emotion, particularly where family was concerned. The service commenced with dignified solemnity. The vicar, a gentle man of florid complexion, spoke warmly of Leonard's generosity toward the church roof fund and his unwavering presence at Harvest Festival. Miss Marple noted that Isabel Brabazon, the niece, sat with rigid composure, the sort that bespoke neither grief nor relief, but rather the chilly efficiency of duty. Beside her stood a gentleman recently reintroduced to the village, Godfrey Brabazon, Leonard's younger brother, returned after decades abroad. His expression was harder to read, worn certainly, but whether by guilt or mere distance, one could not yet tell. The ceremony drew on, as such things must, and the moment came when the coffin was to be closed. The pallbearers stepped forward with muted solemnity, but just before the lid was fastened, a figure moved from the shadows at the back of the church. Clad in a veiled black hat and a long gray coat that fell a shade too elegantly upon her shoulders, the woman approached the coffin in silence. No one stopped her. Indeed, no one seemed to notice at all, save Miss Marple, who observed with that unassuming acuity for which she was quietly renowned. The woman with gloved hands drew a small folded paper from her sleeve and placed it delicately atop the deceased's chest. Her fingers lingered, not with affection but with something far more complicated. Regret, perhaps. Guilt, even. Then just as swiftly she retreated, returned to her seat, and bowed her head. Miss Marple made no outward reaction. She did not nudge or whisper. She merely committed the moment to memory with the sharpness of someone who had long understood that human behavior, when unguarded by grief or propriety, always betrayed itself. The remainder of the service proceeded without incident. Hymns were sung with restrained gusto, prayers offered with expected reverence, and the final procession to the graveyard began with the solemn tread of tradition. The coffin was lowered, earth was cast, the villagers murmured their goodbyes, and still that folded note nestled somewhere beneath the lid, a whisper buried among silence. The next morning brought with it a faint drizzle and a peculiar rumor. It was said that the gravedigger, a man named Horace Lee, known more for his fondness for ale than for metaphysical tremors, had been found sprawled near the edge of Leonard Brabazon's grave, unconscious and muttering incoherently. The doctor called it a fainting spell brought on by overwork and poor diet. But those who knew Horace found the explanation oddly unsatisfying. For one, Horace never missed breakfast. For another, he had no reason to be near the grave once the work was done. Miss Marple, of course, said nothing, not at first. But she had already taken her afternoon walk past the churchyard and had noted two details which, to most, would have seemed inconsequential. First, a subtle disturbance in the soil near the head of the grave, as though someone had attempted to lift, then abandoned the effort. And second, the absence of any flowers or tributes, save for one modest wreath, placed not by the family, but anonymously, with no accompanying card. By late afternoon word had spread, as it does in such villages, that the grave had been interfered with, though nothing appeared to have been taken. Nothing, that is, which the family would admit to missing. Miss Marple meanwhile quietly recalled the gloved hand slipping that paper into the coffin. A paper now gone, with no trace, and no explanation. It would, she thought, be an error to assume this was mischief or morbid curiosity. Such things, in her experience, rarely began with superstition or sentimentality. They began with guilt, and guilt, like a letter sealed and delivered to the dead, had a way of returning, opened. And so, with her knitting bag discreetly packed, and her afternoon reserved for a perfectly innocent visit to the vicar's wife, Miss Marple set out once more, not as an intruder into grief, but as a quiet collector of whispers. For she knew, as surely as the lilies in the churchyard would droop by dusk, that this was no ordinary funeral. It was, in fact, the beginning of something far more troubling, and as always, it had started with something very small, a folded note in a silent church. The next morning, as soft clouds hovered in a pale English sky, Miss Marple took it upon herself to bring a small posy of garden carnations to the churchyard, a gesture of quiet sympathy, and more pertinently, of subtle observation. She had always found that one learns the most when one appears to be doing nothing of consequence. And there, among the still moist grass and leaning stones, she took note of the few flowers already placed upon Leonard Brabazon's resting place, all rather formal, save one bunch of wild violets, loosely tied and clearly handpicked. An odd detail, perhaps, but oddities in her experience were rarely trivial. The vicar's wife, Mrs. Calthorpe, spotted her shortly after, and, true to form, was eager to share a little more than was strictly necessary. She mentioned in her low and confiding tone that Godfrey Brabazon's return had come as a surprise to many. "Not that he's been unwelcome," she said hastily, "but there's something unsettled in his manner. He seems haunted, although by what I cannot say." Miss Marple merely nodded, encouraging the flow without so much as steering it. The gravedigger's incident had also left its shadow, though villagers preferred not to dwell on it. Superstition was an easier explanation than something more sinister. But Miss Marple knew better. Something had shifted at that funeral, subtly, almost imperceptibly, but undeniably. That afternoon, with her knitting basket tucked beneath her arm, Miss Marple called upon the vicar's study, under the pretext of lending a rare devotional pamphlet. While the vicar disappeared into a drawer to find the relevant catalogue, her gaze wandered, quite by accident of course, to a frame propped upon a side shelf. A group photograph, slightly faded, and unmistakably old. It was clearly taken at the Brabazon estate, judging by the background shrubbery and the stone arch visible behind the group. There stood Leonard Brabazon, looking younger but unmistakably himself, with his niece Isabel beside him. Several household staff were present as well, arranged formally in 2 neat rows. But what drew Miss Marple's attention, and held it, was the deliberate space at the far right of the image. The photograph had been cropped, not poorly, but with an exactness that suggested motive rather than accident. A hand remained ever so slightly visible on the shoulder of a footman, though the rest of the figure had been cut away entirely. She said nothing, merely smiled politely as the vicar reappeared with the pamphlet. But the image lingered in her mind as she took her leave, and her thoughts began to arrange themselves, as they so often did. quietly, like threads being woven into a pattern. Later that day she encountered Mrs. Dalrymple, the housekeeper who had once worked for the Brabazons, and now, in semi-retirement, gave occasional help to the vicarage. Over the course of a carefully guided conversation, Miss Marple asked whether the Brabazon household had ever suffered a scandal of some kind. Nothing public, of course, but perhaps an unpleasantness. Mrs. Dalrymple hesitated, just long enough to confirm that indeed there had been something. "There was a girl," she murmured finally with a glance around. "A maid. Alice, I believe. Left rather suddenly, if I recall. There were whispers. Not theft exactly, but something to do with Mr. Godfrey before he went abroad." Miss Marple received this with her usual quiet grace, filing it away like a piece of embroidery to be returned to later. It was not uncommon, of course, for young maids to form unwise attachments, and equally not uncommon for the consequences of such attachments to be managed quietly, particularly in families where reputation mattered more than justice. What stood out was Leonard Brabazon's reaction. It was said he had defended the girl, to his own social cost. The nature of his loyalty was unclear, but its memory still lingered in the margins of village gossip. That evening Miss Marple sorted through her correspondence and retrieved a letter she had received some years ago from a cousin who had once resided in Chipping Dean. It had mentioned Isabel in passing. Rather sharp with the staff, but Leonard always smooths things over. The phrasing seemed innocent enough then, but in light of recent events, it suggested a more troubling dynamic. Intent on gathering a fuller picture, Miss Marple paid a visit to Miss Emily Price, her retired governess who had tutored many of the local families in earlier years. Over tea, Miss Price confessed she had never liked Isabel, too calculating by half and lacking her uncle's natural kindness. As for Godfrey, he was charming, she said, but there was a carelessness in him, the sort that bruises, you know, without meaning to. The conversation circled back to Leonard, whose death had stirred more reflections than grief. "He was a gentleman, no doubt," Emily said, "but not a happy man. Something gnawed at him in those last years. He walked the gardens endlessly, talking to no one. I always thought he was waiting for something, or someone." Miss Marple, who had found over the years that gardens often held more truth than drawing rooms, made a mental note of that remark. For men like Leonard Brabazon, whose lives were measured in quiet respectability, it was the things unsaid that carried the sharpest weight. The final clue came unexpectedly. While perusing a discarded bundle of old parish newsletters at the church vestry, ostensibly in search of botanical notes for a friend, Miss Marple found a brief mention from 32 years ago, a footnote about the unexpected departure of a housemaid from the Brabazon residence, with no reason given. That same edition listed Godfrey Brabazon as having booked a steamer passage to Cape Town, with only 3 days' notice. It was, she thought, too much of a coincidence to be dismissed, especially when taken with the photograph, the whispers, and the peculiar composition of Leonard Brabazon's final years. She sat quietly that evening by her parlor window, darning a stubborn sock, her mind carefully piecing together the outlines of the puzzle. The note at the funeral, the vanished maid, the hidden figure in the photograph, all strands in a tapestry that had yet to reveal its full shape. And yet, already, one thing seemed clear. Someone had returned to Chipping Dean under the cover of mourning, someone burdened not only by the weight of what had been lost, but of what had been taken and buried, but not, Miss Marple felt sure, forgotten. There are few documents more revealing, Miss Marple believed, than the humble guest book. Often regarded as ceremonial or decorative, it was, in her eyes, a voluntary declaration of presence, and, when falsified, an unmistakable signal of intent. It was with this in mind that she paid a quiet visit to the church office, under the guise of donating lace for the altar cloths. While the curate attended to other matters, Miss Marple politely inquired whether she might see the funeral guest book, citing a desire to send a note of condolence to a distant cousin of Leonard Brabazon's, a fabrication so gently delivered that it invited no suspicion. With the book placed before her, she leafed delicately through the pages, her eye trained not on the neat, known signatures of Chipping Dean's established residence, but on the unfamiliar, and one in particular stood out. Mrs. Lydia Gray. The handwriting was controlled, though the final stroke of the Y in Lydia curved with a flourish that felt strangely theatrical. Miss Marple's memory stirred. There had been no mention of a Lydia Gray in the vicar's list of mourners, nor had she heard the name spoken during the small reception held after the burial. She made a soft remark about how lovely it was when distant friends came to pay their respects, then closed the book with care. But in her mind, a new pattern was forming, one that suggested the veiled woman had not simply appeared, but had gone to deliberate effort to remain untraceable. In a village where faces were known and names carried history, Mrs. Lydia Gray had neither, and that, Miss Marple thought, was not the mark of mourning, but of concealment. Miss Marple had long known that if one wished to access the soft undercurrent of village memory, one ought not to visit the constable or the postmaster, but rather the seamstress. The local dressmaker, Miss Agnes Merriweather, had fitted generations of women for christenings, weddings, and mourning, and her memory for figures and fabrics was rivaled only by her memory for faces. During an afternoon visit, ostensibly to inquire after alterations to an old blouse, Miss Marple casually mentioned the funeral and remarked upon the veiled figure who had slipped in so quietly. Miss Merriweather paused, needle in hand, and tilted her head slightly, the way one might when recalling a verse long unspoken. She was familiar, the seamstress said at last, lowering her voice instinctively. Not as she looked now, older of course and thinner perhaps, but I would swear she stood outside the Brabazon gate years ago, waiting in the rain. Miss Marple inclined her head, as though indulging a fancy. Leonard had a great many callers in those days, she offered delicately, but Miss Merriweather shook her head. No, not for Leonard. She was looking for someone else, and no one let her in. The words lingered, trailing off with the wistfulness of a garment left unfinished. Miss Marple gave no reply, but she left soon after with the impression that the veiled mourner had not been a stranger to Chipping Dean. Rather, she had once been someone unwelcome, perhaps even someone turned away. There are names that vanish from the public record but remain etched in private memory, names spoken once and then buried beneath years of silence. It was such a name that Miss Marple now sought, and in her quiet pursuit, she called upon an old friend from St. Mary Mead, who had once worked in the Brabazon household as a lady's companion. Miss Florence Bradbury, though now nearing 90, and given to nodding off mid-sentence, possessed a memory that, when prompted with precision, flowed with remarkable clarity. Over a teapot kept warm by a knitted cozy, Miss Marple inquired gently after the household's former servants, mentioning that the recent funeral had stirred memories for many. Florence's brow furrowed. There was a maid, she said slowly, a quiet one. Alice, I believe. Alice Barnes. The name settled heavily between them. She wasn't there long. Florence continued. Pretty girl, soft-spoken, always seemed a little frightened of Miss Isabel, though who wouldn't be? Then one day she was gone, just like that. No word, no goodbye. They said she'd stolen a brooch, a family piece, I think, but I never believed it. Leonard was furious, said there'd been a mistake, but he was overruled. By Isabel? Florence nodded. Of course, she always made the decisions when it came to the stuff. Leonard might have been the master of the house in name, but it was she who kept the books, and the secrets. Miss Marple did not press further. There was no need. The ghost of Alice Barnes, once dismissed in disgrace, was no longer silent. Her name had re-emerged through whispered recollections, tied to scandal, to pain, and perhaps to the veiled woman who had come to say farewell with a folded note in her hand. The question now was not whether Alice Barnes had been wronged, but whether she had been forgotten. Miss Marple's hands, though delicate with age, moved with habitual care as she opened the well-thumbed hymn book she had borrowed from the church vestry for her private devotion. Her reason for borrowing it had not been spiritual, but observational. She had seen during the funeral that the mysterious woman had held her copy for far longer than necessary, her fingers twitching slightly along the edge, as though concealing something within. It was tucked between the pages of hymn 138, Abide With Me, a thin slip of yellowing paper, folded not once, but twice. Miss Marple unfolded it slowly, her breath held not in suspense, but in solemn expectation. The note bore a brief and jagged hand. A.B. They buried the wrong one. There was no signature, no date, but the writing trembled as though penned in haste or sorrow, or both. It was not a letter meant for the living. It was a message, stark and unresolved, that did not seek answers but declared an accusation. The initials could not have been coincidental. Alice Barnes, dismissed, erased, and perhaps misrepresented in death as she had been in life. The phrase itself held ambiguity. Had they buried the wrong man, or had the ceremony, the ritual of grief, been misplaced, devoted to the wrong legacy? Miss Marple folded the note once more and slipped it into her knitting bag. Truth, she thought, has a habit of rising, like seeds planted in shallow soil. And this note, however fragile, had begun to sprout. The dead had not spoken, but someone had spoken for them, and in doing so, they had stirred the ground beneath long-buried secrets. The incident involving Horace Lee, the gravedigger, had by now woven its way into village conversation, not in any urgent tone, but with the peculiar mixture of amusement and unease reserved for things that defied ordinary explanation. Most dismissed it as the predictable consequence of gin and poor constitution. But Miss Marple had long since learned that rural misfortunes were often dressed in harmless garb. Accidents, in her view, were sometimes only accidents when no one had reason to look too closely. It was with that conviction, quietly held and never proclaimed, that she arranged to call upon Inspector Craddock, ostensibly to ask after his aunt's hip, which had suffered in the previous winter's frost. Craddock, who knew Miss Marple's methods, listened politely but with narrowing eyes as she delicately expressed her concern for the poor man who had suffered such a turn while alone with the grave. He was found unconscious, wasn't he? She asked, almost musingly. And yet there was no sign of illness beforehand, no ailment noted at the surgery. Craddock regarded her for a moment and replied rather cautiously that it had indeed struck him as curious. Miss Marple did not press the matter further. She merely observed, Sometimes people faint not from what they feel, but from what they see. Later that day she took her usual route past the churchyard once more, pausing near the gate. The earth atop Leonard Brabazon's grave had settled oddly, uneven, disturbed, and in her mind a quiet suspicion took shape. If something had been placed in that coffin, or removed, there was only one way to know. It was with a tone of respectful necessity that Inspector Craddock approached the Brabazon family for permission to reopen the grave. To Miss Marple's quiet satisfaction, the request was met not with outrage, but with a curious reluctance, particularly from Isabel, who at first insisted that the matter would only invite gossip. Godfrey, on the other hand, shrugged with a detachment that bordered on indifference. The exhumation was conducted swiftly and discreetly. What the inspector sought was unclear even to those present, though the official reason cited was to rule out the possibility of interference following the gravedigger's fall. But the purpose of such rituals, Miss Marple knew, was never what it seemed. When the lid was lifted, there was a murmur among the watchers. Nothing had been disturbed. The deceased lay as he had been laid, his expression peaceful, his hands folded. But nestled just beneath one hand, partially obscured by the lining of the coffin, was a small velvet pouch. It had not been noted at the time of burial. Its presence was neither explained nor expected. The pouch, when opened by gloved hands, contained two objects, an old-fashioned gold locket and a woman's ring. The ring was plain, but engraved within were the initials A.B. Miss Marple, standing at a distance with the dignity befitting a mere observer, noted Isabel's sudden stiffness and the fleeting glance she exchanged with Elsie, the maid. Godfrey remained motionless, his arms crossed, though his jaw tightened imperceptibly. The inspector asked whether the items belonged to the deceased. Isabel hesitated before murmuring something vague about old family trinkets, probably stored long ago. Miss Marple did not speak, but in her thoughts the discovery rang with unmistakable intent. Someone had placed these things with Leonard after death, not as mementos, but as messages. The initials were too precise, the timing too deliberate. This was not a case of theft, nor of sentimentality. It was a statement, and the only question now was, whose voice had spoken from beyond the grave, and to whom? The answer, she suspected, would not rest quietly for long. The drawing-room at the Brabazon residence had always been a place of cool elegance, polished surfaces, disciplined florals, and conversation rarely straying from the boundaries of propriety. Yet now, in the days following the exhumation, an intangible tension pulsed just beneath its carefully curated calm. Isabel Brabazon sat erect as ever, her posture immaculate, but her hands, once poised with quiet confidence, betrayed a faint tremor as she reached for her tea. Her conversation had grown clipped, perfunctory, devoid of the aloof charm she once wielded so effortlessly. She dismissed inquiries about the locket and ring with an arched brow and a murmured, "Old things have a way of reappearing." Miss Marple, seated quietly beside the lace-curtained window, observed not only the words but their delivery. Isabel's voice, though steady, was laced with an undertone of annoyance, not grief. Her gaze frequently drifted to the mantelpiece, or rather, away from it, where once a photograph had stood. It was now conspicuously absent. Godfrey, meanwhile, had developed an evasiveness that bordered on indifference. When asked, even casually, about the velvet pouch, he shrugged in that disaffected manner of a man too weary or too unwilling to engage. Yet there was something hollow in his detachment, as though he had resigned himself to a battle long since lost. It was the maid, Elsie, who betrayed the most. Normally invisible in her routine movements, she had become almost too quiet. Her footsteps muffled, her eyes avoiding contact. Once as she entered with the tea tray, Miss Marple noticed her hesitate upon seeing Isabel, her hand pausing ever so slightly before reaching for the cups. That pause, Miss Marple knew, spoke volumes. There was something rotten at the heart of the household, something long buried, now disturbed. And those who had lived with the secret longest were beginning to show the strain. The discovery came, as such things often do, with the muted dread of a village mourning disturbed. Word traveled quickly. Godfrey Brabazon had been found dead in the orchard at the rear of the estate. It was Mrs. Partridge, the neighbor's cook, who saw the constable arrive, and later reported the body had been discovered by Elsie, who'd gone in search of windfall and apples. The initial verdict was delivered with grim efficiency. A bottle of laudanum, half emptied, had been found nearby. The physician, summoned without delay, confirmed there were no signs of violence, and so the explanation settled upon the village like an unwelcome mist: suicide. But for Miss Marple the matter refused to rest. She had known men who had taken their lives, and men who had not, though others claimed they had. The telling difference, in her experience, was not the means, but the preparation. Those truly set upon the act often left something behind: a note, a final word, a tidy accounting of thoughts. Godfrey had left nothing. His affairs remained disorderly, his room untouched by the neatness of closure. There was no letter, no indication of regret or farewell, only silence, and that, to Miss Marple, rang louder than any scream. She thought of the look in his eyes during the funeral, the flicker of something deeper than grief, a secret perhaps, or guilt, or fear. And she thought too of Isabel, who spoke of his death with peculiar composure, her tone tinged more with fatigue than sorrow. But above all, Miss Marple thought of Alice Barnes, of initials sewn into grief, of notes slipped into coffins, and of quiet truths trying to surface after decades of stillness. Something had been set in motion, and it had claimed its second life. Miss Marple, as was her way, understood that certain truths aged better in the care of older minds, not because they dulled with time, but because time softened their telling. And so it was that she found herself taking tea with Mrs. Linton, the vicar's mother, who, though mostly retired from parish affairs, retained a keen interest in village history and a memory unsullied by modern distraction. The conversation wandered, as it often did with the elderly, from the state of the church organ to the quality of this year's preserves, until it rested with delicate inevitability upon the Brabazons. Miss Marple mentioned the name Alice with a gentleness designed to coax rather than confront. Mrs. Linton's eyes narrowed with recollection. "Alice Barnes," she said, after a moment's pause. "A quiet girl, not very confident, sweet in her way, but she loved foolishly." Miss Marple said nothing, merely allowed the pores to stretch. She was in service at the Brabazons. There was talk, of course. You can't stop talk. About her and young Godfrey. He always had that look, you know, the kind women mistake for depth. The remark, though mild, held weight. "They said she stole something," Mrs. Linton went on more quietly now. "But it never made sense. I remember Leonard tried to intervene, stood up for her, I believe, but Isabel would have none of it." Miss Marple nodded slightly, the threads tightening in her mind. "She disappeared not long after," the old woman added. "No word, no trace." And in that finality, Miss Marple heard not just scandal, but sorrow. The kind of sorrow that lingered in respectable parlors for years, settling in the corners like dust, waiting to be disturbed. It had long been Miss Marple's belief that the ugliest secrets often wore the plainest faces, not the loud, obvious wrongs, but the quiet ones, hidden beneath a veneer of family duty and well-polished manners. It was not by direct confession that she came to learn the truth of what had occurred between Godfrey and Alice Barnes, but through a careful stitching of remarks, recollections, and omissions, a tapestry that, once seen whole, required no embellishment. What emerged was both tragic and sadly predictable. Godfrey, in his younger years, had indulged in what he likely considered a passing affection. Alice, young and vulnerable, had not understood it as such. The result of their entanglement had not merely been whispers and judgment, but a child, a daughter born in secrecy and concealed with equal discretion. Leonard Brabazon had learned of it, not from his brother, but through the silent desperation of Alice herself. According to one old family friend, he had taken steps to provide quiet assistance, financial and possibly emotional. It had been an act not of rebellion but of conscience, yet his efforts were curtailed by Isabel, whose grip upon the household had grown in direct proportion to Leonard's advancing years. Isabel had not only dismissed Alice but made certain that no trace of her remained. The girl's belongings were removed, her name expunged from the household accounts. What Leonard may have known, or attempted to amend, had been quietly overridden by a niece determined to protect the family name. But Miss Marple understood something deeper still, that Isabel's actions had not been born solely of propriety. They had been born of fear, and fear, as she well knew, was often the mother of cruelty. Miss Marple, having pieced together the matter of Alice's dismissal and the Brabazon family's carefully preserved silence, turned her attention to the missing portrait. She had recalled seeing a cropped version at the vicarage, and the precision of its cut had unsettled her. Photographs, after all, record not only presence, but intention. To remove someone from one was not merely an aesthetic choice. It was an erasure. A conversation with the late Leonard's solicitor, made under the pretext of inquiring into a charity trust, revealed something curious. The original portrait had been stored in Leonard's private study, not destroyed, as Isabel had once implied. Through the quiet assistance of a long-retired secretary, Miss Marple obtained a glimpse of the uncut version. There, at the edge, stood a young woman, hands demure, expression uncertain. Alice Barnes. She had not been forgotten entirely. The discovery confirmed a quiet truth, that Leonard, for all his failings, had remembered her, had resisted, in his small defeated way, the pressure to remove her from the family's narrative. But it was another detail, unrelated on the surface, that caused Miss Marple's breath to still. Through the chemist's assistant, a talkative young man unaware of the weight of what he shared, Miss Marple learned that only a fortnight earlier, Miss Isabel Brabazon had requested a small quantity of digitalis, supposedly to treat an infestation of moles in the garden. The dosage had been precise, the quantity small, enough perhaps to avoid suspicion. Miss Marple said nothing of what stirred within her thoughts, but in the link between a preserved photograph and a carefully measured poison, she saw the makings of a desperate strategy, one stitched together not from madness, but from control. And control, once threatened, could turn lethal. The final thread, the one that would bind all others, emerged not from speculation but from paper. A revised copy of Leonard Brabazon's will, prepared privately and never formally executed through the family solicitor, was discovered within a locked drawer in his writing desk. It had been placed there, folded, initialed but unsigned, alongside a letter addressed simply, "To be opened in the event of my death." Though lacking the full weight of legal authority, its contents were unambiguous. Leonard had intended to leave the entirety of his estate not to Isabel, nor to Godfrey, but to one, Miss Lydia Gray, born Lydia Barnes, the daughter of Alice Barnes, formerly in my employ. Miss Marple read the line twice, then once again, slowly. There was no doubt now. The veiled mourner, the woman who had placed a note in the coffin and vanished thereafter, had not merely returned in mourning. She had returned as heir. The implications were considerable. If Isabel had known, or suspected, the contents of this document, then the events that followed no longer seemed reactive. They became preventative. The poisoning of Godfrey, the silencing of old servants, the carefully staged disinterest, all could be interpreted not as cover-ups, but as calculated acts designed to protect a vanishing claim. What Leonard had failed to do in life, he had tried to correct in death. But his final effort had been too quiet, too delayed, and others had moved more swiftly. Miss Marple closed the folder with gentle fingers. Justice, in this case, would not arrive by legal instruments alone. It would arrive by observation, by insight, and by truth, unearthed in full, like roots long buried beneath tidy flower beds. There were few settings in which truth revealed itself more naturally than over a cup of tea. Miss Marple had always understood this, that the ritual of pouring, sipping, and sweetening created a rhythm in which even the most guarded of hearts might falter. And so, she extended the invitation to Mrs. Lydia Gray, with no pretense but every intention. Lydia arrived precisely on time, her coat buttoned to the neck, and her gloves removed only after polite insistence. She sat, prim, almost brittle, and accepted tea with a gratitude that sounded rehearsed. Miss Marple, having observed the same posture in many a woman carrying a private sorrow, moved gently through the opening pleasantries. They spoke first of flowers, of weather, of nothing in particular, until with characteristic softness, Miss Marple made mention of Alice Barnes. Just the name. Lydia's fingers froze against the rim of the teacup. Her gaze dropped. For a moment there was silence, then breath, then words. "She was my mother," she said, with a quiet finality that needed no confirmation. What followed was not confession but release. Lydia had spent her life piecing together fragments, whispers from foster homes, names in half-forgotten letters, the unspoken knowledge of illegitimacy never fully denied. When she learned of Leonard Brabazon's death, something had drawn her to Chipping Dean. Not revenge, not even justice. Simply a need to be near. She had entered the funeral under a name not her own, unsure of her welcome, uncertain of her purpose, but compelled by something older than logic. And when she stood over the coffin, she had known only one thing for certain, that she could not leave without saying goodbye to the mother she had never known. Miss Marple nodded, not as judge but as witness. There was more, she knew, and it would come. Lydia did not speak of her grief in sweeping statements. She did not weep or lament or seek sympathy. Her pain was older than tears, the kind that settled into a person like roots beneath a stone. She had not come to claim anything, she explained, nor had she expected to find any warmth within the Brabazon name. She had known, by instinct rather than information, that her mother had died young, alone, dismissed, perhaps disgraced. There had never been a grave to visit, no place to lay a flower or utter a name aloud. And so, when she saw Leonard Brabazon's death notice, she came, not to stir the past, but to place it gently in the earth. The note she had left in the coffin was written the night before the funeral. It was brief, clumsy perhaps, and not meant for any living eyes. "Forgive me for what I did. They will never know." She had written it not because she had done wrong, but because she had survived, had grown, married, borne children, while her mother had been cast away and forgotten. The guilt, unearned yet deeply felt, had lingered all her life. The words were meant as apology, not for an action, but for a silence that had never been hers to break. Miss Marple listened without interruption. When Lydia finished, she simply poured more tea, allowing the quiet between them to settle. Others might interpret the note as accusation, she thought, but it had been, all along, an act of mourning, and yet, she felt certain, someone else had misread its meaning entirely. When Miss Marple, with customary delicacy, inquired whether Lydia had been aware of Leonard Brabazon's will, the woman's response came without hesitation. Numbera never knew he had written anything. There was no defensiveness in her voice, only a kind of tired surprise. She had not, she said, come in search of property or claim. The name Brabazon held no warmth for her, and the notion of inheritance seemed almost absurd. She had lived a life apart, unacknowledged and unseen. To imagine that Leonard had remembered her, or her mother, in such a concrete way, was difficult to accept. When Miss Marple gently described the revised document, naming Lydia as beneficiary, the color drained slightly from the woman's face. "I had no idea," she said softly. "I would never have asked for that. Never." And Miss Marple believed her. The quiet sincerity of a life built without entitlement could not be feigned. Lydia's presence at the funeral, her manner of speech, her very restraint, all pointed not to motive but to burden. She had come not to claim what was owed, but to confront what had been lost. Still, Miss Marple could not help but think of those who might have known or guessed, and of what they might have done to prevent the truth from surfacing. For while Lydia had no interest in the will, someone else had, and in that fear they may have left behind something far more revealing than they intended. Though others now spoke of closure, of the family matter having resolved itself in quiet dignity, Miss Marple was unconvinced. There was a hollowness to the stillness that followed, as though too many had been too eager to move on. Godfrey's death had been swiftly explained. Isabel's composure remained too perfectly intact, and Lydia, the rightful heir, had returned to her small home with no intention of contesting a thing. It was too tidy, and Miss Marple had never trusted tidy endings. Her thoughts returned to Leonard Brabazon, not as benefactor but as a man who had once defended a maid against scandal, who had kept a photograph uncut and a name unforgotten. And if such a man had gone to the trouble of revising his will, would he not have left something more personal? Some word perhaps meant for the one who would never be acknowledged in life. With quiet resolve, she requested a final glance through Leonard's study, on the pretext of retrieving a borrowed gardening journal. There, behind a locked drawer, she found what she had suspected all along, a single envelope, yellowed with age, marked in his hand, "To the one I failed to protect." She did not open it, not yet. But in that moment the case, for it had become one, however veiled in domestic civility, shifted. The motives no longer lived in scandal or shame, but in prevention. Someone had feared what this letter might reveal. feared it enough perhaps to silence a brother and deny a name. Miss Marple's eyes lingered on the ink, faded but clear. There was one more story left to be told. It was not announced as a confrontation. That was not Miss Marple's way. No raised voices, no dramatic accusations, no trembling fingers pointed across tables. Merely an invitation to tea, extended to those most concerned. Isabel Brabazon, Elsie the maid, Inspector Craddock, and with quiet hesitation, Lydia Gray. The setting was Leonard's own drawing room, a place accustomed to civility and the clink of porcelain, not the settling of hidden accounts. The mood within was strained, though cloaked in the manners of a well-bred gathering. Isabel arrived precisely on time, dressed in unrelieved gray, and carrying with her the air of a woman who had endured much and expected little gratitude for it. Elsie followed, uncharacteristically subdued. Lydia sat with folded hands, composed but pale. The inspector, knowing Miss Marple's instincts to be far more than idle curiosity, took his place with a notebook he never once opened. Miss Marple, seated in the least assuming chair, opened the conversation with observations on village daffodils and spring weather. It was not until the tea had been poured and stirred that she spoke of Leonard's amended will, a will which, until now, only she and the inspector had seen in full. At the mention of Lydia's name, a hush fell. Isabel's teacup did not tremble, but her lips pressed together in a thin, unmoving line. Elsie shifted in her chair, eyes fixed on the tray. Miss Marple's voice remained soft. "I think," she said mildly, "we've all known for some time that not everything about Leonard Brabazon's death, or what came before it, has been entirely honest." No one replied, but the silence, heavy and brittle, marked the moment the storm ceased to gather and finally began to fall. It was not the discovery of the revised will that disturbed Isabel most. It was the knowledge that someone else had seen it, and more importantly, someone had understood it, that Lydia's quiet return had not gone unnoticed, that the past which she had so carefully buried had stirred of its own accord. Miss Marple, without accusation, outlined what she had come to understand. Leonard, burdened by what had been done to Alice Barnes, had taken steps to correct the injustice, not publicly, but privately. The amended will, though never formalized, had made clear his intentions. Everything was to go to Alice's daughter, and Isabel had found it. Miss Marple paused, letting the weight of that sentence fall into the space between them. Isabel's expression remained composed, but her breathing betrayed her. Shallow, deliberate, rehearsed. "You must understand," Miss Marple continued. Isabel had built a life upon control. Control of the household, the estate, the family narrative. The appearance of Lydia, quiet, unknown, and entirely legitimate in her claim, threatened not just the estate, but the version of the past Isabel had crafted. Inspector Craddock looked up at that. "And Godfrey?" he asked quietly. Miss Marple inclined her head. Godfrey had grown careless. He had spoken to Elsie, perhaps too freely. Perhaps he had guessed, or remembered, the truth about Alice. Perhaps he had seen the will. In any case, his silence could no longer be trusted. The poison, Miss Marple explained, had been obtained in a manner most calculated. A small dose of digitalis, requested under a plausible pretext, and administered with subtlety, disguised in Godfrey's habitual tonic, enough to ensure death without suspicion, but too much, as it turned out, to pass unnoticed. Craddock gave a brief nod. Isabel did not move. "You see," Miss Marple concluded gently, "it was not hatred that led to murder. It was fear, the kind of fear that grows when one's place, one's power, begins to slip. Isabel's hands remained folded, but the quiet fury behind her stillness had, at last, given way to something else, a kind of resignation. It had been, Miss Marple said softly, a most unfortunate misunderstanding. The note placed in the coffin, the note that had vanished and reappeared in whispered speculation, had not been a threat, nor a warning. It had not been addressed to Leonard Brabazon, nor intended as a challenge to the family's claim. It had been a message from a daughter to a mother, written in the quiet hours before the funeral, folded with care, and laid gently into a space where words could no longer be answered. Isabel, Miss Marple suggested, had misread the gesture, or perhaps in the shadow of her own guilt, had read into it exactly what she feared most, that the truth was known, and vengeance was near. She had seen the initials A.B., seen the locket and ring, seen Lydia's face, and assumed the worst. Her reaction had been swift, precise, and utterly devastating. But it had been born not from knowledge, but from error. Lydia, seated at the edge of the room, said nothing. Her face remained calm, but a single tear rested, unmoving, on her cheek. Elsie, when asked, admitted through quiet sobs that she had seen Isabel enter the study in the days before Godfrey's death, that she had heard raised voices, that she had feared, but had not spoken. Miss Marple, with one final glance about the room, folded her hands in her lap. "There is no justice," she said gently, "in protecting the truth too late." And outside the window, the wind stirred the garden once more. Miss Marple had always maintained that the truth, when it emerged, did not do so in a blaze of drama but crept in quietly, like mist across a lawn. It was not one thing that had led her to the truth, but several, each small and easily overlooked by those not attuned to human frailty. The photograph, for instance, once cut, later found whole. Leonard had not destroyed Alice Barnes's presence. He had preserved it, albeit discreetly. That alone spoke volumes. Then there was Elsie, whose unease had begun the moment Lydia reappeared, the way she had flinched when Miss Marple asked about the photograph, the hesitations, the silence, not guilt, but fear. And Isabel, so composed, so precise. Yet Miss Marple had noticed the letter opener on Leonard's desk had recently been moved, its usual fine layer of dust disturbed, as though someone had rifled through drawers in haste. She had also observed the faint scent of camphor, used often to mask the odor of medicinal tinctures. And Miss Marple remembered, quite clearly, that Isabel had spoken of keeping the garden moles at bay, not a week before Godfrey's collapse. No one clue had been definitive, but together, their weight undeniable. "I did not accuse," Miss Marple said gently. "I observed, and in the end those observations pointed to only one person who stood to lose everything. Not from what was done, but from what was about to be revealed." Inspector Craddock looked across at Isabel, and still she said nothing, but her hands, folded so tightly in her lap, had begun to tremble. The drawing-room remained suspended in silence. Then, with a suddenness that belied her earlier poise, Isabel stood. Her voice, when it came, was not loud, nor was it emotional. It was the voice of a woman who had spent her life constructing the walls around her, and now realized they were crumbling. "I only ever did what was necessary," she said, her gaze not on anyone in the room but somewhere far beyond. "You cannot allow sentiment to undo what is built over years." Miss Marple remained still. She had seen confessions before, some wild, others dramatic. But this was different. This was not regret. It was rather the weariness of control relinquished. "I knew who she was," Isabel continued, "the moment I saw her. And I knew what it would mean. The estate, the name, the story we had buried. Leonard was a fool to cling to the past. Godfrey couldn't keep his mouth shut." There was no need for further detail. Her words confirmed all that had been uncovered. Elsie buried her face in her hands and Lydia sat motionless, her face pale but unreadable. Inspector Craddock stood quietly and approached Isabel. "I think, Miss Brabazon," he said with quiet formality, "we've heard enough." She looked at him once, with something between defiance and resignation, then allowed herself to be led from the room. Miss Marple did not speak for a long time, but as she looked at the empty chair where Isabel had sat, she felt no triumph, only the quiet certainty that justice, when it finally arrives, is never as clean as one hopes. It arrives slowly, painfully, and sometimes far too late. In the weeks that followed Isabel Brabazon's arrest, the affairs of the estate were inevitably thrown into administrative disorder. Solicitors corresponded, executors argued, probate was delayed. Yet amid the bureaucratic turmoil, Lydia Gray remained curiously still. Miss Marple, having known many types of ambition, recognized in Lydia neither greed nor calculation. There was no trace of the vengeful heir, nor any desire to rewrite the past through title or land. And so it did not come as a surprise when Lydia informed the family solicitor, in tones both firm and gentle, that she had no intention of claiming the Brabazon estate. "I am not a Brabazon," she had said simply, "and I have no wish to become one." The solicitor, though flustered, accepted her position. Arrangements were made for the assets to pass, as Leonard's original will dictated, to a distant cousin of no particular distinction. The village whispered. Of course, some called her noble, others naive, but Lydia paid no heed. There was only one act she chose to pursue. With quiet funds from her modest savings and the reluctant permission of the church council, she arranged for a stone to be placed at the edge of the parish cemetery. It bore no grand inscription, no florid verse, only a name: Alice Barnes, beloved mother, not forgotten. Miss Marple attended the quiet blessing of the grave, though no others did. She stood at a respectful distance, gloved hands folded, and watched Lydia kneel beside the freshly laid earth. There were no tears, only stillness, a daughter paying tribute not to a legacy, but to a life denied one. The wind stirred faintly as the vicar murmured a final prayer, and Miss Marple, gazing at the modest stone, felt a gentle easing in her chest, the kind that comes not from resolution, but from remembrance rightly placed. Back in her own garden, where roses had begun their spring bloom in soft, hesitant blushes, Miss Marple resumed her daily rituals with quiet contentment. There was comfort she found in the return of order, in the folding of linen, the dead-heading of blooms, the familiar clink of teacups returned to their shelf. Yet something within her stirred with a melancholy that clung to the corners of her mind, like shadows at the edge of a well-swept parlor. She had seen once again how pain and memory entwined themselves over decades, how secrets could be tended like hedgerows, clipped neatly on the surface while tangled beneath. Isabel's crime had not been one of impulse but of preservation, a misguided effort to control the story that others might tell. Miss Marple reflected on how often such efforts began with the smallest lies: a dismissed maid, a hidden photograph, a letter never signed, and how easily the pursuit of respectability could twist itself into cruelty. There was no pleasure to be found in Isabel's downfall, only a quiet acknowledgement that even the most gracious of facades might conceal a deep and enduring fear. Her thoughts turned to Leonard Brabazon, a man whose late remorse had come too softly, too slowly. He had tried to make amends in his way. Yet the letter, the revised will, the sealed velvet pouch, they had been acts of a man who could not bring himself to speak aloud the truths he knew. Still he had remembered. That counted for something. As she pruned a climbing rose, Miss Marple allowed herself a rare indulgence of thought, that justice, when it did come, often bloomed not in courtrooms, but in gardens, in names restored, in burdens laid down, and in the soft, stubborn growth of truth, long buried but never truly lost. It was on a quiet morning, one washed in the golden light that April sometimes offered without warning, that Miss Marple sat at her window, a book resting lightly on her lap, and her thoughts drifting in the gentle rhythm of contentment. The story had come to its end, not tidily, not triumphantly, but in the way most stories do when lived by real people and mocked by real pain. She thought again of Lydia, now gone from the village, her address left with the vicar in case of correspondence. She had returned to her modest life with a dignity that refused either pity or pride, and in that, Miss Marple found her most admirable. The window was slightly ajar, and a robin had taken up his usual post on the sill, his chest bright, his head tilted in that ever-curious way that seemed to suggest he had always known how things would turn out. Miss Marple smiled faintly. There was something comforting in the presence of robins. How they returned year after year, often to the same spot, singing the same songs, as though some things at least remained constant in a world that often was not. And yet, it was not constancy that brought the comfort today. It was closure. Not the kind handed down by judges or preserved in law books, but the quieter kind, the kind found when names are spoken aloud once more, when stories once silenced are finally told, the kind of justice that does not punish, but restores. Miss Marple closed her book gently and watched the robin hop once before taking flight. "Yes," she murmured, though no one heard her. "I believe that will do." And so it ended, as such things should, not with ceremony or noise, but with the whisper of wings and the soft bloom of truth. And so, with a name restored and a secret no longer buried, the story of Alice Barnes comes gently to rest, not in scandal but in remembrance. In the end, it wasn't force or fury that uncovered the truth, but observation, patience, and the quiet persistence of justice. Miss Marple, as always, did not need to raise her voice, only her eyebrow, and her attention to the tiniest of human details. This story reminds us how the past is never quite finished with us, that what's hidden behind the hedgerows of a respectable life will, eventually, bloom into the light, even if decades have passed. And that concludes today's journey into the shadows of mystery and deduction. What did you think of this case? Did you see the twist coming, or did it catch you by surprise? Share your theories and favorite moments in the comments below. Love to hear your take. And if you're craving more thrilling detective tales, don't forget to like this video, subscribe, and hit the bell so you never miss the next mystery. Until then, stay curious. The next clue might be closer than you think it.